Good evening, everyone in United States. This is Dr. Adityanji. I am the President and Chairperson Board of Directors of ICHRRF. And we are here for our Friday evening fellowship training program seminar. So this is our logo. And on behalf of the Board of Directors and the Executive Committee of the ICHRRF, I invite all our audience to yet another seminar in the ICHRRF Professor Ved P. Nanda Fellowship Training Program. As most of the people know, this flagship training program was started on January 1st, 2022. And this is our distinguished faculty, Professor Ved Nanda, Professor Yashwant Pathak, Professor Nalini Rao, Professor Lavanya Vemsani, myself, Mr. Clements, Mr. Tripathi, Dr. Yashodhan Agolgaonkar, Professor Nidhi Shandurikar, and Dr. Richard Benkin. And we have two fellows currently in the fellowship training program. Ripudaman Pachori joined in January of 2022, and Anushree Ghisad joined on July 1st, 2022. So our fellowship training programs have a standard format. Usually first 25 minutes, there's a presentation by the fellow after they have done their research and review of the topic. Generally, there's a 10 minutes commentary by our chief mentor, Professor Ved Nanda. This is followed by 25 minutes of discussion of the topic by the faculty preceptor, and last 30 minutes are there for a question and answer session. So that is the standard format. Today's topic is gender targeted war crimes and sexual atrocities. And of course, our fellows presentation says July 30th, because she's 12 hours or 10 hours ahead of us. But here in United States, it is Friday, July 29th. Our seminars are from 9 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. and this becomes Saturday morning, 6:30 a.m. to 8 a.m. A couple of announcements. As I said, Anushree joined on July 1st. The report on special hearing on Kashmir Hindu genocide will be scheduled in month of August. We have pending applications for January 2023 session, and we are inviting volunteer faculty members for this fellowship training program. So if anyone knows any academic or university professor who are interested in this, becoming faculty, we invite them well. Before I hand over the floor to Anushree, there's one more announcement. While I'm speaking, Professor Nanda tried to call me, so I'll find out afterwards whether he's going to be late or whether he may not join. But I really want you to focus on this picture. And this picture is from Sinjar in northern Iraq or Iraqi Kurdistan from August 2014. And these girls are Yazidi girls who have been targeted for their gender in a genocide against Yazidi people by the ISIS and its collaborators. So the picture showed a 10-year-old Yazidi girl who was raped until she died when ISIS invaded the Yazidi areas. Unfortunately, in the Western media, Yazidi genocide has disappeared from the headlines and nobody talks about it, despite missing 2,719 Yazidi women and children who were in ISIS captivity. So we are talking about very heinous crimes against humanity in a targeted manner for the gender in war or warlike situations. A few housekeeping rules. Right now, there's nobody from outside, but we invite people to stay on mute, change their cell phone settings to vibration mode. When a fellow or faculty are speaking, please don't interrupt them. Only those people who identify themselves openly are allowed to ask questions. Questions should be sent through chat function, and we want everyone to be very specific and precise in asking a question. Lastly, like every seminar event of ours, it is going to be recorded and it will be available as resource material under the fellowship section in our website. So I will encourage people to look at the entire material in future on our website. And as I stop speaking, I do see that Professor Nanda just joined. So Anushree, the floor is yours and Professor Nanda is here.
Namaskar, Professor Nanda. I see Ripudamanji has also joined. Namaskar, Ripudamanji. I begin sharing my presentation. I believe everyone is able to view my presentation, right?
Yes, we are able to.
Okay. So the topic given to me is gender-targeted war crimes and sexual atrocities. Slide is not moving. Somehow I am unable to move the slide.
Maybe take it off presentation mode and try. Otherwise, I can always share.
Just a moment. Sorry.
No worries.
Let me
Take your
try
time.
that. Just a moment. I hope this time I would be able to.
Yeah, the slides are visible. Yes.
Okay, great. So this is how I propose to go about with the presentation. First of all, we will try to see gender-based war crimes in the historical context. Then what are the various types of gender-based war crimes? And we would try to discuss it with some examples. Then I would like to focus specifically on war crimes against males. I would also like to shed some light on international legal instruments. Then what is the present day condition? And then we would reach to a conclusion. So this is how I wish to go about it. Now, gender-based war crimes and atrocities, it encompasses a multitude of conduct which is directed at a person specifically because of their gender. It basically resonates to violence which is inflicted against women and girls precisely because they are females. Now, it itself is a manifestation of human rights violation of discrimination based on sex. Because of this pervasiveness of sexual violence, it impedes women and girls of their ability to exercise A. Civil and political rights, B. Economic, social and cultural rights, and C. Third generation rights such as peace and development. Now, history is replete with a number of examples. Muslim world has a written history of concubinage. Now, Muslim soldiers in early Islamic conquest were given female captives as a reward for military participation. These female captives were frequently purchased and men were permitted to have as many concubines as they could afford. So there is also one book by Saubhagya Ranawatji, which has original notes from the time of Santa Mirabai and Rana Sangha of 16th century. It records history of rape, nude march, convergence in this Mira Charita. This book also goes on to mention Johar and why it was performed. So it was basically performed to avoid war crimes and necrophilic tendencies of the invaders. So if you remember way back in 2007, when former President of India Pratibha Patil was a presidential candidate, she went on to comment that Parda system was introduced in India, and I quote, to save women from Mughal invaders. So recognizing preponderance of such crimes, even Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj had an official zero tolerance policy towards gender-based war crimes. So history is replete with gender-based war crimes. Now coming to specific examples of gender-based war crimes and atrocities, for my understanding or based on my understanding, I have tried to roughly categorize it in two basic categories. The ones which are very obvious in the sense that they have to this day received some amount of attention by academia, and the other ones which I have called the covert ones are less discussed, particularly because they have not been given much attention, and also because in my opinion it is difficult to quantify such kind of war crimes. Adityanji, I also tried to, initially my plan was to include as many pictures as possible to underscore every specific type of war crime. But personally, I found those pictures very heart-wrenching. So I decided to stick to this format. So coming to the very first form, very first type, which is using rape as a tool of genocide. So gender-based war crimes are not limited to rape alone, but rape constitutes the major portion of these crimes. During the Bangladesh Liberation War, this is way back in 1971, numerous women were tortured and raped by Pakistani army. Most of the women were captured from Dhaka University and private homes, and they were kept as sex slaves inside the Dhaka cantonment. Various researchers goes on to give the estimate between 2 lakh to 4 lakh, which is still considered to be an understatement. These women were put in a compound under a guard. First of all, they were segregated, then they were put under a compound, and they were made available to the invading Pakistani troops. A lot of them actually died in those camps for being raped again and again. Now, the other angle is usage of women as human shield. Now, this is something which is difficult to per se pinpoint and quantify. So if you see Sri Lankan government's Maxwell Parangama report, it stated that LTT was principally responsible for loss of civilian life during the final phase of Elam War because of their actions of using Tamil civilians, especially women and children, as human shield. There is another example. During the 2007 siege of Lal Masjid, it was the Pakistani army which went on to state that the Islamic militants used girls as human shields. Let us come to the sexual slavery. Sexual slavery is considered a war crime against humanity. It is also prohibited by the international law. Now, conviction of this general named Bosco Tangda, this was in July 2019. This is the first ever conviction for sexual slavery as a war crime, and it was a part of situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We also have example of the Japanese army which forced some 2 lakh women into sexual slavery during World War II. These women were known as comfort women. Now, try to see this in comparison with forced marriages. There is critical difference between sexual slavery and forced marriages. And how so? Aside from lightly catering to physical needs of their husband, the females in forced marriages are required to perform forced labor also, like cooking, washing, carrying ammunition and other looted items of their rebel husbands. Additionally, these women are also expected to bear children of their husbands. Then there is another element of psychological trauma of those women being labeled as wife. because there are so many examples in Sierra Leone where it goes on to state that such conflict wherein women were part of forced marriages, these women demonstrated diminished capacity for them being labeled as wives of their husbands. The female end up the female ended up feeling the social pressure that accompanies raising children from this kind of marital union. Now, coming to the next part, insecure environment, conflict situation or warlike situation does end up creating a very insecure environment. And refugees or internally displaced people, especially women, they remain in such kind of insecure environments and they're often deprived their basic amenities. This kind of insecure environment also creates climate of impunity in war zones, which further leads to exploitation by individual soldiers, because the soldiers know that they will not be punished no matter what. Now again, try to juxtapose this with loss of basic human dignity, and I could not find a better term for this. So what I mean by that is this. This is what I had come across in Afghanistan. So during the civil war in Afghanistan, and I'm talking about civil war, we know that there was an exodus of Afghan Hindus and Afghan Sikhs. Now, as you have a large number of people migrating from a community which is already a minority in Afghanistan, the overall negotiating power of remaining Afghan Hindus and Sikhs was reduced to practically zero. Which is why even the pressure of forced conversion on this remaining community of Afghan Hindus and Sikhs in Afghanistan was much higher. Which is why it came to a point where Afghan Hindus particularly refused to send their daughters to school because they always felt that the pressure of conversion would be much higher on them if they end up attending schools where Islamic curriculum was mandatory. And also the societal approach was not very conducive. So you see, what happens basically is that you had a community which produced uh, professionals and well qualified doctors, engineers, lawyers. Now it had an entire generation of girl child which has not even seen school and they are practically illiterate. So because they are illiterate, they would possibly find it difficult to come out of this vicious cycle of poverty. So this is, in my opinion, basic loss of human dignity, which is very difficult to quantify by any means. Moving on, there are cases of enforced conscription. So during the conflict of Sierra Leone, rebels forcibly conscripted women and girls into the rebel forces for a very prolonged period of time. Such child soldiers were depicted in photos carrying automatic weapons and they were apparently very high on drugs. Same example can be seen in Liberia also. Abducted girls had to play dual role of sex slaves and child combatant. The victims of forced conscription are, so this is the forced conscription. Now, disownment by family is something which is again quite underreported. So there would be the cases where these women would find it very difficult to integrate back into their family and community, because if they were forced wives, then they still carry that stigma of having been married to a rebel and having been assisted that rebel in his rebellious activities. Victims of forced conscription, they are often shunned by their next to kin. I had a Afghan friend of mine who had conducted research in Kandahar, and during that research, he came across this staggering example wherein, on one particular day, the NATO forces had invaded one specific village in Kandahar province, and the forces suspected that one terrorist was taking shelter in a family, which is why they raided that family, and in that process, they tried to see faces of everyone covered under burqa. So they happened to see face of one particular female also. What happened next day is that husband of that female, he convened jirga. Jirga is the local court within the Pashtun culture. And he announced that since face of his wife was already seen by the Kharijis, meaning the foreigners, the honor of that woman and his personal honor were totally compromised. And the jirga, in a way, gave sanction for killing the wife of that husband. Now, this is something which is very difficult to quantify as a war crime. We have stories of Bosnia Herzegovina where Muslim women actually denied of being raped by Serb soldiers because their husbands would divorce them if they were admitted that they had been raped. So the stigma forces victims to suffer in silence, and in many cases it prevents them from moving forward with productive lives. Coming to enforced prostitution, there are umpteen examples of enforced prostitutions as a part of gender-based war crimes and atrocities. There is another category which in my opinion is very covert, which is voluntary prostitution. But that voluntary prostitution is done under extreme duress, and it is often seen as the only means of survival. So there was a research conducted wherein this girl child from Colombia, she actually joined rebels to run away from the domestic violence. She ended up telling this researcher that many girls who had left the movement, they finally ended up being the sex workers because that was apparently the only strategy to survive. This is also true for the victims of sexual exploitation in another war conflicts also. The last category, again, in my understanding, is that of orphan girls or girl child heading households. So the terrible toll of war also makes many children into orphans overnight. In many parts of the world, we are seeing these child-headed households where children have to fend for themselves and also for the older children. I have seen in Afghanistan where this happens especially to girl children who have to take over role as parent also. These parentless girl children, they often live in very deplorable conditions. Buildings are broken down with leaky roofs or sometimes no roofs at all. They sleep together under torn plastic sacks, cook with old rusty cans. Their potteries are often broken, which is why they are susceptible to so many diseases. And the situation is totally vulnerable and heart-wrenching. So there is a popular perception that rape during conflict is primarily targeted against women. But rape of men by men during war is not that uncommon. See, 76% of male political prisoners in 1980s El Salvador and 80% of concentration camp inmates of Sarajevo reported being raped or sexually tortured. So this data shows that the sexual violence committed against men is not a marginal occurrence. Lack of awareness for the magnitude of rape of men during conflict relates to chronic underreporting. Now, what are the consequences of this phenomenon? Sexual violence against men, it weaponizes the idea of gender and sexuality against victims. It also reinforces gender hierarchies, and it causes tremendous physical and mental pain to the victims. See, in traditional setup, men are expected to exert violence, while women are the ones who are at the receiving end of it. But in conflict situation where men are raped, this dissolves the traditional dynamics and puts men in receiving role of the victim. Now, other than this, conservative view on homosexuality in certain part of the world, where homosexuality is basically punished harshly, it leads to stigmatization. So, for example, there is a research which is conducted which goes on to showcase that the Ugandan male rape victims, they choose to stay silent out of fear of being branded as homosexuals. Homosexuality is widely condemned in Uganda, and male victims of sexual violence often struggle to get proper support because they are accused of being gay. Acceptance within society is a challenge. Acceptance within family is also a challenge. Coming to our second last slide, these are the international legal instruments that we have in hand. In 1950, international community established Geneva Convention, relative to the protection of civilian persons in the time of war. It was in response to increasing vulnerability of civilians during wartime. Yet the war-related sexual violence was seldom prosecuted, even under this Geneva Convention. So the solution was development of international military and ad hoc tribunals. What these tribunals did was to allow international community to prosecute war criminals. Again, in these tribunals also, gender-based war crimes were never in focus as such. This situation changed until the development of International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, and International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR. So, ICTY is the first ad hoc international criminal tribunal to be established by the Security Council. It was way back in 1993. Its jurisdiction extended over genocide, crime against humanity, crime against war crimes, etc., etc. But it also had the specific mandate and authority to try crimes of sexual violence as a violation of international law. Then just in the span of 1 year, we had United Nations Security Council establishing ICTR to address the genocide that raged in Rwanda. Now, ICTR was established in less than a year, but ICTR differed from ICTY in a sense that ICTR was established in response to a conflict that was solely intrastate in nature. However, the UN Security Council used the precedent which was created by ICTY to allow for an international criminal tribunal in Rwanda. And just like ICTY, ICTR had the legal authority to prosecute gender-based war crimes. Further, in 2008, UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1820, which noted that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute a war crime, crime against humanity, or constitutive act with respect to genocide. Coming to the present day situation, present day situation in a way has not changed. So I'll just give you 3 examples. Maybe in the interest of time, I will cover 1 or 2 only. This is in the first example is in the context of Tigray war, which started in November 2020. So you have Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and he goes on to say this on public forum. He says that it's probably wrong to say this, but those who went to fight, as in the soldiers who went to fight, they didn't just go and come back. Each of them had about 10 kids. And when he said so, there was a laughter in the audience and there was even an applause. He further stated that sexual violence in the war was insignificant compared to military deaths. And his comments to this extent, I don't find them worthy of mentioning on this platform. Another example is that of Yazidi women, which Adityanji mentioned at the beginning of our seminar. Now, ISIS is involved in systematic abduction and rape of Yazidi women as young as 12 years of age. Many have been given to fighters as a reward or sold as sex slaves. Some critics would again say that this is sort of a conspiracy or allegation against ISIS. Wait. Far from trying to conceal these practices, ISIS itself has boasted about these practices. And in 2015, they established a Department of War Spoils to manage slavery. There are independent research which are conducted, which goes on to showcase that when these Yazidi survivors are interviewed, they goes on to mention as to how they were segregated from men and boys, and then they were moved in an organized and methodical fashions and taken to various places in Iraq and Syria. Quickly coming to our conclusion, gender-based war crimes have only recently been recognized by the international law. But sexual violence has been a part of virtually every war the world has ever known. So for centuries, rape was seen as an inevitable consequence of war and a way to boost soldiers' morale. The taking of brides by victors was also viewed similarly. Now, later, rape was seen as a crime against family honor. It is only in the last century that rape has come to be seen as an offense against woman's dignity rather than a property crime or a crime against her family or her husband's honor. Codification against rape during war tended not to be enforced. International community was reluctant to prosecute gender-based war crimes even when domestic law prohibited them. A number of countries have only within the past few years reached a consensus to prosecute the perpetrators of gender-based war crimes. As mentioned earlier, military and criminal tribunals have existed only for over 50 years. Yet gender-based war crimes committed during this time were largely ignored. Prosecution of rapists in war crime tribunals was a rare prior to the late 1990s. Now, although the progress demonstrates, there has been a progress which has demonstrated gradual evolution of gender-based war crimes prosecution, starting from the Tokyo trials of 1940s to the establishment of ICTY and ICTR. There is still enough that needs to be done. The investigation and prosecution still needs much advancement and advocacy through an emphasis on accountability, individual symbolic and monetary reparation, and reduction of stigma. Only a holistic approach that is focused on both rehabilitation of victims and improvement of methods to bring perpetrators to justice can help the international community properly prevent, address, and prosecute gender-based war crimes. With this, I end my presentation. Dhanyavad.
Thanks a lot, Anushree. That was a very, comprehensive research on gender-targeted war crimes and sexual crimes. I'll invite our chief mentor, Professor Nanda, to give his comments and suggestions. So let's hear Professor Nanda, please.
Sorry, Adityanji, I have trouble with my internet, so I'm going to excuse myself today.
Okay.
I can't hear very well. The trouble is that I haven't been able to, I watched, but I had trouble, so I couldn't hear it.
Okay. Today is one of those days that we are having some serial issues. Professor Nalini Rao is unreachable. She's presumably somewhere in very remote area in India at this point in time during, school summer vacation. So she's not here. So we will just open the discussion to all of us. Maybe Professor Pathak may have some comments. Professor Pathak, are you there, sir? Okay.
He's there in spirit.
Okay. Ripu Madhavanji, do you have any comments or observations on this topic? You've been reading the literature in this area.
Yes, Adityanji, thank you. It was a very good presentation. One of the point that you mentioned about using women as a tool for war. There have been cases where women was also used to humiliate opposing army. So the enemy women was purposefully raped, their mother and children or the daughters were raped in front of the soldiers so that they can be humiliated. You also mentioned about so many conventions and steps taken by the international organizations like UN, Security Council. To add that thing is, like NATO forces also have been well known for this kind of treatment to the women during the world wars, various world wars. The Allied forces are known for this kind of conduct against women in Germany and in other places. Even after the victory that they declared during the World War II against Germany, still their soldiers kept on raping for another 3 days. And yeah, over a million women uh, of the age of their grandmothers also being raped. So there are these kind of incidents also, which are not very well recorded. And the one is um, like you were giving example of the Ethiopian president. And the irony was the American journals or Allied Force officers who knew who let these things happen would never uh, be charged or tried um, after this went to public. That's the thing I wanted to add.
Thank you, Riputamanji. I think there was a little bit of confusion in what you said earlier. You equated actually Allied forces with NATO. NATO is a post-World War II thing. What you were trying to say that Allied victorious forces raped, subjugated, surrendered German women after the victory in World War II. NATO was actually not even in existence during World War II and immediately after that. But your point is very well taken. You have discussed it in previous seminars, and I compliment you for bringing this, in open, because this is a well-guarded secret of the Western civilization that they have done actually targeted gender-based crimes when they were the victors in Second World War. I'll invite our executive director and a faculty preceptor for this seminar series, Mr. Clemens, to give his comments.
Thank you, Dr. Advanji. Thank you, Anushree, for your presentation. Yeah, I just wanted to add to Ripudaman's comment, and then I had a couple of questions. So yeah, even on the eastern side, we see that in the Pacific Theater, we see that there was a mass rape of Japanese women by the American occupying forces in Japan after the end of World War II. We often talk about the Korean sex slaves of Japanese soldiers, but we don't talk about the other side. So similarly, the British Empire in India, up until the late 1870s, it was a big part of the British Army in India to procure and to keep sex slaves for the British Army. In fact, in the UK, it was always advertised for 100 years before that. Come enroll in India and you'll get to have sex with a lot of Indian prostitutes, with very disparaging remarks made about the chastity of Indian women and so forth. So we don't talk about that enough. I had a couple of questions. So we talked in the presentation about the rape of women by men and of men by men. But what is the role of women in facilitating the sexual exploitation of other women? Like, for instance, I'll give a couple of examples. Like, for instance, in international sex trafficking rings, we see that women actually form a big part of the grooming gangs. For instance, like the one that's in the news is with Jeffrey Epstein, but it was Ghislaine Maxwell who really helped groom the girls and get them into the system, and then also helped gain customers for the girls that they kept. Similarly, the sex grooming gangs in the UK and other countries by Muslims, mainly Pakistani origin Muslims in the UK, they were not just men who were doing it. It was very often women who helped groom some of their own friends, either to marry in or to become girlfriends, to provide girlfriends for Muslim men within their community. So that part is something I want to understand. Are there laws that focus on that? Because this subject seems to be very much like it's just men doing it. Women are completely the innocent party in this. I want to understand that part. And my second question was, for instance, in Iraq, in the Abu Ghraib prison system of the U.S., we heard of cases where female U.S. soldiers raped male inmates in Abu Ghraib, and some of them even came back pregnant. I don't know how that really works, to be honest, just even biologically, but I wanted to understand, how does the law see that? Is it, according to the law in any country or internationally, is it possible for a woman to rape or sexually abuse a grown man?
Carl, I'm going to intervene here, and I would not ask Anushree to answer those two questions.
Okay.
Having said that, the first question that you have raised is not within the purview of this seminar. Okay. What you're talking is about civilian issue, supposedly in peacetime. And this seminar is focused on war-related, gender-targeted crimes. So it's a totally different discourse. It's a very valid observation. It is very likely that this topic will be taken up in future seminars.
Okay.
So let's keep it separately. Your second observation is very interesting. Anushree did mention that the rape was not only used, sort of, somebody has a dog somewhere.
So yeah, my brother has one. I'm going to mute myself.
Okay. So I think that's a very interesting observation, because Anushree did mention that rape is not only used about the, sort of captives of war, but also to humiliate. And the key word is humiliation. Humiliation of the opposite army, the warring army. Humiliation of the warring soldiers. So, in that sense, rape is not a sexual crime, but it is a war crime to humiliate your adversary. It becomes a tool. It is irrespective whether a man is raping a woman, a man is raping a man, or a woman is raping a man who is captive. It is the power display. And in fact, in some countries, a demand has been made that the laws regarding rape should be gender neutral. So when you say that how it is possible, again, it is not within the purview of this particular seminar, but I do have the information. If you look at this concept of women raping men, grown-up men, it does happen. You research South Africa, and there are female gangs who kidnap lonely men and indulge in gang rape. Okay. Again, it's part of the civilian thing, grooming, kidnapping, abduction, whatever. It's not part of the kind of war, this thing, but yes, those things do happen because sexual violence is used as a tool to humiliate the adversary, whether rape is done by a person, whether rape is done by use of a stick or an object, or whether rape is done by use of an animal. You have all these examples. Whether they happened in war setting or not is a different issue. So let's not go into a different purview. Probably for the civilian crimes and all, we will have a totally different topic, but related to the concept of rape.
Makes sense. Thank you, sir.
Since Professor Pathak is not around, I'll give a few comments and then we will close the seminar. We have a very brief seminar because two of our faculty members were not able to participate in this. So, Anushree, there's a little bit of critique of your last slide. You did mention that the rape has been there in almost every ward. In every ward, that is what you said. Go back to the last slide, the top line. Last or second last slide.
Not in the wars which were fought under the leadership of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj.
Well,
This is the last slide. Can you see it?
you have to share it.
Or do I have to share it again?
To share it.
Just a moment.
So this says historically sexual violence has been part of the war. And that is a absolute statement.
Yes.
It is really not true. You already
Yes.
said that it was not part of the wars fought by Chhatrapati Shivaji. But I will tell you, rape was not part of the Ramayana war. Rape was not part as a tool in Mahabharata war, despite whatever the stories are about, Draupadi and, sort of Vali's behaviors towards Sugriva's wife, but those were actually not part of the actual war. And so in two historical major wars in India, there was a code of war and subjugation of females, civilian females, was never part of the war. And this was also again seen during the time of the first Hindu sort of, kingdom after the Mughal, invasion of India by all the wars fought by Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. There was the same code of conduct. To the extent that after Afzal Khan's death in warlike act, his, I think, daughter-in-law was captured and brought to Chhatrapati Shivaji, and he apologized and called her mother and sent her back. So it's a question of the ethical standards. Now, I just want to go a little bit into history. So there is a word called mal-e-ganima. Okay. So the mal-e-ganima is by God's grace, the booty of the war. In Arabic, mal-e-ganima. Version of that is mal-e-ganimat. And that's your, Urdu translation for the same concept. And from the beginning of Islamic conquest of countries outside Arabian Peninsula, this was used as a war toolkit to boost the morale of the fighting soldiers, capture the civilians and use them whatever they wished. And it was what was your right hand possesses, whatever your right hand possesses. So that was halal for you. Okay. You did mention concubinage and all that sort of thing. So there were actual terms.
Right.
Male ganima. Interestingly, etymologically, how the word slavery came into picture. The original word is Slav. In 9th century conquest of Spain by Moors or whatever, Islamic, battalions or lashkars or whatever, East European women and East European are Slavic people. So Slavs were captured, Slavs were kidnapped, and Slavs were used as male ganima. The word slavery comes from that. We say sexual slavery, but slavery itself, the connotation was sexual subjugation. The modern word slavery comes from word Slav, which is a race. So there's a detailed history of capturing Slavic women and using them as booty of the war by marauding Islamic armies. And again, in an environment of political correctness, in post-World War II lexicon, we tried to whitewash whatever had happened in the history in medieval times. But it's not just medieval times. I did mention about Sinjar, what happened, and you did mention that. But the problem of sexual slavery and exploitation of Yazidi women is much more complex in Sinjar region. It's not only the ISIS, the Western world likes to blame ISIS, but the Peshmergas also did the same thing to Yazidi women. And nobody wants to acknowledge that. Only if you talk to Yazidi people, you talk to Yazidi women, they will say that both were equally ruthless, equally, exploitative. It's a different thing that the ISIS became the dominant entity. So yes, it was done at a much larger scale. But in Iraqi Kurdistan, it's not just the Iraqi Sunni Muslims, but also the Kurdish Sunni Muslims that constituted the Peshmerga armies. They also did the same thing to Yazidi women. So it's a question of othering a community which is not of the same religious affiliation you are, and it was again an example of Male Ganima. Now we can say that it happens in warlike situation, but not all the time it happens in warlike situation, because you have now non-state actors. ISIS was a mini state, although it was not recognized. It was fighting a very organized war, just like states do. Its aims were imperialistic, expanding their army and the territory and establish caliphate. So you can say it was a traditional war. These were soldiers were fighting the war, so Geneva Convention will apply to them. But you look at a country like Nigeria, where there is a terrorist organization called Boko Haram. And Boko Haram kidnapped en masse 300 schoolgirls who were 10 years, 14 years, 12 years. These were abducted. These were forcibly converted and quote unquote married off to Boko Haram soldiers or Boko Haram terrorists, whatever terminology you may use. So again, you see gender-targeted sexual violence and sexual slavery and forcible marriages for some of these captured Nigerian girls. So ultimately, it's not just the war but any kind of conflict, whether the conflict is between state versus non-state actor, in Tigray, there were states involved, but there were non-state actors also involved. And there are problems from either side. So I think it's an important subject. And unless nation states adhere to a code of ethics of war in a true sense, we will not be able to eliminate these things, because so-called civilized countries, whether it was in Iraq, Abu Ghraib prison, or anywhere else, it was used as, there were actually famous photographs taken by American forces in Abu Ghraib prison. And yes, the enemy detainees were stripped naked and threatened with dogs, with violence and sexual violence, and what was said were also rape by female soldiers who were their captors and guards. So I think we have a lot to focus on in international community and international law. And so far, the process of bringing it to justice has been highly selective. Unless that selectivity is gone, we will not be able to stop these crimes. Any last comment or questions by anyone?
Adityanji,
Yes.
can you see the slide now? I have made some changes in the very first line.
Yeah. Okay. Very good.
So
Very good.
apparently, the standards of moral and ethics and the value system which was adhered to in Satyayug, Dwapar Yug, Treta Yug was much different than what we are living in Kali Yug. So what I meant by that first statement, it was absolutely wrong on my part to generalize it. Of course, one can say sexual violence might have been the part of many wars, but we have seen staggering exceptions in our own country.
We have seen historical documentations of lack of this as a toolkit of war.
Right, but that is a phenomena one can, I believe, argue in Kali Yuga. So is that fine now?
Well, that's okay. I
That's
just
okay.
wanted to mention that,
Right.
that there are historical documentation of those wars. These are as good historical depictions as any other history. It does not show anything. Whereas the Allied forces did commit sexual violence and rapes, whether in Japan or in Germany, as victorious armies. So we need to accept that, document that, and not glorify that. It's sad and unfortunate that people who were responsible for rapes of 1 million German women were never brought to justice, were never prosecuted. All right, we will thank you, Anushree, for discussing this very emotive topic, and you did the right thing by not bringing too many pictures there. I think you did the right thing, because we don't want to use violence porn. We want to discuss academic details of the problem without resorting to sensationalism or violence porn. So thank you very much indeed to Anushree, and thanks a lot to all the people who joined. Well, Professor Pathak joined finally, so he gets the last word. Sir, you are on mute. Kindly unmute yourself.
I was here for all the time and I was told to mute myself, so I did that. And then once you are mute, then your video is of no use, so I stopped my video too. But anyway, it was a good presentation and I like the comments from all of us. So thank you very much and look forward to more discussions in future also.
Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. And with that note, we will end this seminar. It should be available on our YouTube channel later on.
Yeah, surely. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
God bless you all.